Emulation is something that is just getting more and more important as time goes by. As we are moving more into a digital era of video games where game consoles and video games themselves really are just considered entitlements, real ownership just doesn't seem to exist anymore. So we have a stronger reliance on emulation to play older retro games, and I think this is very important. And in today's episode, we are going to discuss the best emulators, at least in my opinion, of 2025. And of course, if you have your own thoughts and opinions, please let me know what they are in the comments below. But without any further ado, let's go ahead and jump right in. Now, the very first emulator that is one of my favorite emulators of 2025, and something that I know people were telling me to take a look at the end of last year, but it was not released publicly, is Azahar. Now, Azahar is an open source 3DS emulator that is kind of the continuation of the Citra project. Now, if you recall, last year Nintendo, when they took down Yuzu and Ryujinx, Citra was kind of collateral damage in the takedown of the Yuzu emulator as well, but Azahar kind of has risen from the ashes of the dead Citra project and emerged as a public release in 2025. And it is an exceptional 3DS emulator. And look, 3DS emulation, I will admit, is not something that I've been using in the past too frequently. I know that Citra obviously has been around, but I haven't really gotten into 3DS emulation until recently. Now, I will say that Azahar is an incredible emulator with some amazing features. Not only does it have top-tier performance and compatibility, it just has great speed with really good optimizations, and it has that concept of the internal resolution upscaling, which I think is very important to kind of a modern emulation feature set that most people are looking for. But you have the ability to really just crank up the internal resolution. And just as an example, take a look at some of these, these clips that I've kind of captured here for you guys. It looks absolutely fantastic. So the emulation is of a really high quality. The performance and the compatibility and the way that it looks is exceptional. It has various backends. It includes OpenGL and Vulkan renderers for your different needs and depending on the type of graphics card that you have. There's also Android builds out there. I know the Android community is really kind of going from strength to strength here in 2025. There always seems to be regular releases and updates where it even includes things like dual screen support for Android foldables. Now, I don't have an Android foldable device, but I've heard that the performance and the way that it runs and looks on Android foldables is really awesome. It also features things like compressed ROM formats. There's also methods to basically connect to the eShop and re-download things for legitimate backups. There's customizable touch controls. There's texture filtering. There is quick save support. There's turbo mode. There's just a wide range of features that you would come to expect from a modern emulation experience. Look, it's not perfect. It's still very much in active development. There are some things that I've noticed that could use improvements. The save state support is a little questionable, but it will definitely get better. But look, check out Azahar. It's a fantastic emulator. Definitely one of my favorites for 2025. I will leave a link to the GitHub page in the description below and check it out and enjoy it. I think you'll really have a great experience with it. Now, of course, it wouldn't be the best of emulation series without RPCS3, and in 2025, the open source PlayStation 3 emulator has seen significant and steady development throughout the course of this particular year with some incredible updates. But I will say that the compatibility list of playable games, while that percentage has increased, it's still just a little higher in the 69% bracket, which may disappoint some people, but overall, this is still probably about 30 to 50 titles that have seen their status increase to the playable status. So any type of improvement is very much welcome. RPCS3 gets a lot of updates. There's that rolling release model where there's basically master builds that are compiled almost every single day. So there's always some updates to the emulation that are either very, very minor or quite notable. Now, in September, there was rolling release of the 0.38 version or 0.038 release that had 184 commits and 24 contributions over the course of like over 100 days, which is something that's quite interesting because the biggest kind of feature that has been added in recent times is the multi-slot save states, where users can now create multiple save states per game via the shortcuts, and it really does enhance the gameplay experience. There's also been some interesting technical improvements in recent times with the Vulkan hot patching for transform constants. There's been additional SPU fixes as well. There's been RSX enhancements, including command barriers and reservations. There's been fixes to audio, there's overlay tweaks, there's LLVM updates as well. Back in April, there were various updates to the PPU and SPU that kind of fixed a bunch of different games as well. But what else is really there to say? RPCS3 is probably one of the most important and one of the best emulators that has ever been developed. And look, it's really just kind of continuing to preserve all things PlayStation 3, as PlayStation 3 is still very much a closed system, a closed architecture. The only really way to get these games off the PlayStation 3 at this point is emulation, and RPCS3 is kind of the sole emulator that does the job. It's incredible, and look, I'm very much looking to the future, and in 2026, I think there are some really big things to come, but a great year for RPCS3, and it's always going to be in my list of best emulators, and no doubt that it was in 2025. Now, I think this particular emulator not only is one of the best that I've used in 2025, it's also one of the most promising and one of the most rapidly advanced emulation experiences that I've used in a very long time, and it is known as Ymir. Now, Ymir is an open source Sega Saturn emulator that has been developed by Striker X3. Now, its original public release was earlier in 2025, and we're up to the 0.20 version here just in October, which was the last release of the emulation publicly. Ymir has over 90% compatibility of the Sega Saturn's titles, and we're talking about 1,000 or so titles in the Sega Saturn library. Now, 90% may sound like it's quite low when you think about Sega Saturn, but if you go back and think about or look at Sega Saturn emulation, it's not always been an easy road to get a really good compatibility list because of the complexity of emulating the Sega Saturn in of itself. But the thing that makes Ymir so great is not only is it very compatible with the majority of the Sega Saturn library, most importantly, it's a very user-friendly experience. Every single month there has been a release, a public release, an update with some significant key advancements. We've seen improvements to things like the SH2 emulation, the 68000, the DMA timing boosts. There's many games that run even without low-level emulation. There is a really polished user experience and UI. You can just drag and drop your ISO images and they can just load automatically. There's recent games list, there's welcome screens, there's Tate rotation, there's hotkeys, there's save states, of course, there's updates. It supports various types of inputs, including arcade racer, mission sticks. There's also customizable bindings. There's rewind up to 1 minute at 60 frames per second. There's auto BIOS region detect. There's backup RAM and DRAM management. There's really great de-interlacing and progressive high-res modes. Check out Virtua Fighter 2, for example. It looks really good. There's great performance, and the input latency on this emulation is fantastic. Like, I can barely notice any input lag at all, and I think there's been some work that was done to kind of reduce input lag on this particular emulator. But it's also a very cycle accurate emulation experience. It really just has that smooth gameplay, and it just feels great. It kind of came out of the blocks as just another Sega Saturn emulator, but it's kind of now I would consider a compatibility leader. I think it's the best-in-class Sega Saturn experience for my mind. Now, other people may have their own opinions. I know some people like Yaba Sanshiro, for example, but overall, I think it's a excellent, accurate, fast emulator with a great user experience. And look, I just love it. I think it feels good, it looks good, and it plays good. So definitely check out Ymir if you want a great Sega Saturn experience. You'll definitely not be disappointed. Now, earlier this year, I made a video that kind of upset some people, and I talked about the state of Nintendo 64 emulation in 2025, where I felt like it was still very much lacking behind what we would come to expect. And the best emulator that I talked about in that video, and the one that I've always been using over the last couple of years, is Simple 64. Now, earlier in February of this year, Simple 64 ended up being archived, and I gotta be honest, I was a little confused and puzzled as to why, but I needn't worry because Gopher 64 is essentially the continuation of Simple 64 with some additional features. Now, Gopher 64 is an open source N64 emulator and has been written entirely in Rust, which has an emphasis on compatibility, performance, ease of use, without relying on things like game hacks and plugins, which is something that I talked about in my video back earlier this year, where I felt like the plugin system was very much archaic in 2025 and just didn't really have a place. Gopher 64 is an incredible Nintendo 64 emulator. Now, it does need a fairly beefy system in order to run properly, but what it does offer is a very high compatibility list of many games. I think it supports around 95% of the N64 library without any type of hacks or tweaks or changes. It can run the open source libdragon homebrew, which is something that only emulators such as Ares was capable of in the past. So you can run your homebrew applications as well on this emulator. There's also built-in netplay. There's also enhancements for multi-slot save states. Now, a lot of people didn't like Simple 64 due to the fact that it didn't have any type of internal resolution upscaling. But in Gopher 64, you can have high-res rendering up to 4K. And this is really awesome. It looks very clean, and it's the best kind of internal resolution upscaling implementation that I've seen on a N64 emulation. I mean, just take a look at these graphics. This is almost transformative when we consider these games are running on the Nintendo 64. The other feature that it does support is overclocking, and this is a very unique feature that can really help with some of the slowdowns that you see in some games to really smoothen them out. And in some areas, such as a game like Pilot Wings, which has an uncapped frame rate, it really can kind of smooth out those frame rates and offer a kind of 60 FPS experience across the board, which is really awesome. I haven't really tweaked around with the overclocking too much, but in the short time I have used it, it is a very interesting and unique feature. The performance and the overall compatibility is excellent. It's seeing nightly updates on GitHub. There's also various builds available, including flat packs as well. And look, Gopher 64 is a top quality, best-in-class Nintendo 64 emulator. I'll leave a link to the GitHub in the description below, and as always, check it out and let me know your thoughts about it. Now, just like RPCS3, PCSX2, the PlayStation 2 emulator, is probably going to end up in my best of list almost every year, and it has been pretty much since I've been making these videos, and there's a good reason for that. The open source PlayStation 2 emulator has made significant improvements in 2025. There's also been various Android ports of the emulator that people are very excited about. But for me, the key thing about PCSX2 is that it's continuing to get better as far as compatibility. We're almost at near complete compatibility. The other thing that's happened obviously this year is that there have been various major releases, including the 2.40 release in July, which implemented render targets, which really fixed a lot of graphical glitches in many titles. There were various Vulkan and DX12 optimizations for high resolution upscaling. There was also the implementation of the big picture mode for couch gaming, MacOS compatibility. There was also the concept of automatic game fixes where per game patches were applied with optimal settings, including things like speed hacks and widescreen mode, 60 frames per second patches on boot, so there was no more manual tweaks required if that was a thing. There was also various other improvements, including more integration with retro achievements, which is something that a lot of people are very excited about. There was an ongoing SPU2 rewrite for improved accuracy, and overall compatibility at 99% or over 99% means that approximately about 4,000 PlayStation 2 titles are playable. It runs great on mid-range PCs. You can hit 4K 60 on an i5 with a GTX 1060. There's also fallbacks to the software renderer for accuracy. And look, overall, it's a stellar emulation experience that just continues to get better. The Android ports, as mentioned, there's ARM SX2 and Nether SX2 that has really gone from strength to strength, and people are very excited about it. There's modding for HD textures, 60 FPS patches. As mentioned, PCSX2 is an absolute powerhouse of an emulator that continues just to get better and better over time. It's one of the best ever made, and look, its trajectory over the last 5 years has been incredible, and I'm very excited about the future of this emulator, and I think there's really some more big things to come, and I'm looking forward to the future. Now, this emulator is one of my favorites, and it's continued just to get better over time, and it is known as Messen 2. Now, Messen 2 is obviously the update to the original Messen emulator that was an open source NES emulator, but Messen 2 is a cycle-accurate emulator for NES, Super NES, Game Boy, Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance, PC Engine TurboGrafx 16, including CD-ROM, Game Gear, Sega Master System, WonderSwan Color, SG-1000. What makes Messen 2 so great is that it is a highly accurate emulator, but it doesn't require a massive amount of processing in order to run well. There's also enhancements like HD packs and various video filters. There's rewind and run ahead, net play, overclocking, custom palettes, input lag reduction, auto save states, high res modes, borders, all the kind of bells and whistles you'd come to expect from a modern emulation experience. But I think the reason why I go back and use Messen 2 a lot these days is because of its really great debugging tools. Take, for example, this introduction sequence to The Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past. This kind of outlines what's actually going on with each of the different layers, as well as the different screens that you have on the Super Nintendo hardware, and you can kind of see how the system itself is kind of constructing the main image that you see on the screen by applying the various layers together, and also by applying the sub and main screens together using the various addition and subtraction modes of the color space that we've talked about here on the channel in the past. It's very, very helpful in kind of showing off how things work behind the scenes, and this is not only for Super Nintendo, this is for other systems that Messen also supports as well. But across the board, Messen 2 really kind of is exceptional with all the systems that it supports. Just by looking at the various debug menus and looking at the disassembly code and setting breakpoints and kind of playing around behind the scenes, you can get an understanding about how things work. It's also very helpful for things like ROM hacking as well. And look, overall, this is an incredible emulator that I simply can't live without. This is one of my go-tos when it comes to emulation, and I absolutely love it. Now, we have to talk about some honorable mentions that didn't necessarily make the cut, but I do want to kind of highlight them in this particular episode. Of course, Shed PS4, the PlayStation 4 emulator that is very well known for running Bloodborne at good frame rates and considered playable at 60 frames per second on high-end PCs. But we've had some pretty significant updates this year where more games are slowly starting to get into game, including Ratchet & Clank, God of War 3 Remastered, Drive Club, and The Last Guardian. And in recent times, the 0.12 update that just released here last week also allows games such as Persona 5 Royal to get into game as well. As you can see here, this is my gameplay footage of that particular game. So I'm very, very encouraged about the progress of Shed PS4 in 2025, and look, I don't think that this emulator is going to slow down anytime soon. I think 2026 is going to be a big year for the emulator, and I do expect, some really significant updates to come out. But look, it's been a very interesting year for Shed PS4, a good year, some big announcements, some big updates, but I'm very excited about the future of this particular emulator. Now, the next one is Supermodel. And Supermodel is a Sega Model 3 emulator that we have covered on the channel in the past. So when we're talking about games such as Virtua Fighter 3, Daytona USA 2, Scud Race, that's the emulation that we're talking about. Now, Supermodel 3 has been around for quite a while. It's not a new emulator, but in recent times it did see an update which incorporated a user interface to the emulation. and there has been some minor GPU tweaks as well and some minor updates to the emulation, with about 90% of the 50 Model 3 titles are considered playable across the board, and we can run this emulation at high resolutions at 4K up to 60 frames per second. It also incorporates netplay support. There's widescreen modes for the various games that support it. Now for Sega Model 3 games, Supermodel has been the de facto emulator that I've recommended for years, and that hasn't changed, but now with the user interface, I think it's opened up the emulator to more people that want to check it out. I love this emulator and I've always been a big fan of it. And look, I did want to highlight its updates in 2025 as one that I think are quite important. So check out Super Model 3. If you love Sega Model 3 games, you will not be disappointed. Now the next emulator on my honorable mentions list has to be Xenia, the Xbox 360 emulator. It's not necessarily an emulator that has seen massive improvements in 2025, but it has seen the inclusion of the Linux and Proton Deck support, which means it can now run natively on devices such as the Steam Deck. There's been updates to FSR and HDR and various game patches as well. And look, overall, it's a very solid emulator with hundreds of titles considered playable. For me, Xenia is the go-to emulator that I like for Xbox Live Arcade games. It seems like it runs the majority of XBLA games, and that is something that I really like to go back and check out. But look, Xenia definitely gets a mention for 2025. Look, I would like to see the compatibility of the emulation improve, but I understand the complexities of the PowerPC architecture and the 360 architecture. A very, very important emulator, and one that I definitely wanted to single out in 2025. So there you have it. They are my picks of the best emulators for 2025. And in many ways, I feel like we were licking our wounds after Nintendo came in and just took away Yuzu and Ryujinx from us. A lot of us were kind of questioning what the future of emulation would look like. But I think the community has just kind of hit back in a big way with some really incredible work this year. Not only have we seen some fantastic newcomers in the form of Azahar and Ymir really kind of rise up and take the crown of best-in-class emulation experiences for 3DS and Sega Saturn respectively. There's also continued work on the classic and traditional emulation such as RPCS3, PCSX2. I'm really happy about Gopher 64 kind of coming in and just continuing on the work that Simple 64 was doing. And of course, let me know what your favorite emulators were in the comments below. There's obviously a lot of stuff that's happening on the Android side that I haven't really taken a look at. I'll definitely check out Android, probably more in 2026. I'll pick up an Android device and kind of jump in and take a closer look at all that, because there's definitely a lot of really cool things that are happening there. And let me know what the best Android device to check out is in the comments below, guys, because I will pick up a device and take a close look at the emulation on those devices, because I think that's a very interesting space and it's growing rapidly. But hey, we're going to leave it here for today's episode. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked it, please don't forget to leave me a thumbs up, and we'll catch you guys in the next episode. Bye for now.